Good evening and welcome, everyone. Madeleine Albright is chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and also chair of Albright Capital Management, an investment advisory firm focusing on emerging markets. As Joe said, Dr. Albright was the 64th Secretary of State, and most importantly, the first woman to hold that high office. Prior to that position, she was our ambassador to the United Nations, and also served in President Clinton's cabinet and on the National Security Council. However, her service at senior levels in government preceded that in the Carter administration, where she was the National Security Council's congressional liaison, tapped for that position by one of her professors and mentors at Columbia, Dr. Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor. Currently, she is a professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and I can't imagine anywhere else where she would more logically be. She chairs both the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs and the Pew Global Attitudes Project. She is also the president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation and a member of the advisory committee to the U.S. Defense Department's secretary. Dr. Albright did her undergraduate work at Wellesley College and her advanced studies at Johns Hopkins and then master's and doctoral degrees from Columbia. In 2012, she was chosen by President Obama to receive the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in recognition of her contributions to international peace and democracy. And on top of all of these incredible professional accomplishments, she is also the proud mother of 3 daughters. I don't know how you did it all and do it all, Madam Secretary. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Madeleine Albright.
So, Elaine, we've spent the day together, so we have to be on a first-name basis.
That would be lovely.
So, thank you for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. Not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." And I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometers, and the TSA guard looked at me, and he said, "Oh, my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you always have to come to Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you?" So we stopped the whole line, and we have my picture taken. And then I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia?" So thanks for straightening that
out. Joe and I told you were going to have a good time tonight. First of all, we want to welcome you back to the museum, and most of all, on behalf of the foundation and the museum, thank you for your incredible role in getting us that iconic artifact Joe mentioned, which is the staircase from the top of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The staircase climbed by thousands of South Vietnamese and American civilians and troops escaping during the fall of Saigon. It was discovered over the tattered remains of the embassy in 1994 by our very own trustee and civic leader, Hank Meyer. He was there on a business trip, and after that, the museum staff commenced on a long journey, several years of letters back and forth, to the State Department, which didn't, frankly, want to give it to us because they thought it should go to the Smithsonian, and we knew they wouldn't put it on display the way we would. So at any rate, then stepped in Dr. Albright in her role as Secretary of State. She was here, as Joe mentioned, for a panel discussion of Secretaries of State and happened to ask President Ford if there was anything she could do, and voila. Would you like to tell the next phase of the story?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and this is a fabulous museum and the library that goes with it, and despite the way you all read my credentials, I had the highest regard for President Ford and everything that he did, and we got to be friends, and I then, well, Dr. Kissinger thought that was better not to have it because it was so many dark memories. And yet President Ford, I think, felt very strongly that he was the most honest person about history. And so then we did manage to get it here. And I think it belongs here. And I'm very glad that I was able to do that. Very, very honored to. When I was here one time, President Ford introduced me as the Tiger Woods of foreign policy. I don't know what that means now, but anyway.
I hadn't heard that. Well, he loved golf. So
I know.
Maybe, from him, that was the ultimate.
It was a good thing at that point.
Oh, dear. Well, I'd like to begin this evening's conversation by talking a little bit about Dr. Albright's background. Your youth, as you stated earlier, was in Europe during the late 30s, early 40s. Dr. Albright was born in Prague, then lived in London during the war with her parents, was back to Prague, then Switzerland, and finally the United States in 1948 when she was just 11. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the memories that you have shared in your new book, Prague Winter, and how those childhood memories and experiences might have influenced you in the development of your career and especially as Secretary of State.
Well, it's a complicated story. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and Czechoslovakia was a country that came into existence in 1918 as a result of World War I and a very close relationship with Woodrow Wilson. The first president of Czechoslovakia was a man called Thomas Garrig Masaryk, who married an American and, interestingly enough, took her maiden name as his middle name. There are not a lot of people that do that, even these days. Her name was Charlotte Garrig. And then the Czechoslovak Constitution was modeled on the American Constitution, with a significant exception in that it had equal right language in it in 1918. And so my parents were of that first generation of very proud Czechoslovaks. My father went into the diplomatic service and was serving as press attaché in Belgrade when I was born. My mother wanted to have me in Prague, so I was born in Prague. And then when the Nazis took over, my father didn't want to be there and wanted to be with the government in exile. So we spent the war in England and my father was very young at that point. My parents were in their early 30s. At the time, you think they're old, but basically very young. And he was the person in charge of broadcasts from BBC into Czechoslovakia all during the war. Then and I really I'm bilingual. I used to sound very British, but I grew up bilingual in school in England, and then my father, after the war, was made ambassador to Yugoslavia. And so, the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I used to do for a living. And then when the communists took over, my father, he had a last job as the Czechoslovak representative to the UN to deal with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. And he took that job, came to the United States, and defected. And so we came here in 1948. The book is kind of in 3 layers. The inner layer is this story. In addition to, I finally put together my rather complicated background. I was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish. So that whole story is in that. Then the second layer is about World War II and the various aspects of how it started, what happened when the United States came in. And then the third layer is about the difficulty of making moral decisions. We all think that they are black and white. They are not. And, how do people behave during a resistance? What is a collaborator? What are the decisions? So that is the book, and it is called Prague Winter.
It's wonderful. I recommend it highly. With that background, perhaps we can all appreciate why Václav Havel and the Velvet Revolution might have meant a great deal to you. And could you share, this is 1989, could you share your feelings when you got the news as a native Czech?
Well, interesting, because part of the thing I grew up in Denver and I went to college in the East and studied an awful lot of the changes in Central and Eastern Europe, and people were fascinated by what was going on. The Hungarians had their revolution in 56. The Poles revolted every 5 years. And people really came to me and said, what's the matter with you Czechoslovaks? You're not doing anything. There had been a very brief period in 1968 during the Prague Spring, but then normalization and nothing happened. And so what was interesting, all of a sudden, the wall comes down, and you have a piece of it here, and there was this magical person that appeared, Václav Havel, who was a playwright and somebody that kind of sparked up the whole sense of what I had grown up with, of Czechoslovakia being a very special country with people that understood what it was to be a part of the West and who had basically very good values. And so I was very, very proud. And the thing that happened was that you mentioned the National Democratic Institute. At the time, I was vice chairman of the National Democratic Institute, and I had, we kind of provide the nuts of help in democracy, not imposition, which is an oxymoron, but promotion in a way of being helpful. I had gotten to know the man who became the foreign minister because he had been a journalist, and I had written my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in '68. So all of a sudden, when the Velvet Revolution happened, I called him up, and I said, can I do anything to help? And he said, yes, help the students, because they're the ones who did this. I then went to Prague in January '90, and this man, Jiří Dienspier, said, would you like to meet Václav Havel? And I said, of course I would. So he took us there, and Havel knew that he was meeting with some American delegation. So I handed him, my father had written a book called 20th Century Czechoslovakia. And I'm giving him this book, and he says, oh, I know who you are. You're Mrs. Fulbright. And I said, no, I'm Mrs. Albright. And so that was, and what happened was we had a great meeting, and he needed help on writing an electoral law, and we managed to get some people there. And then the people that we were with said, you know, we're just setting up the president's office here. Can you help us? And I said, sure. So we go to some restaurant, and I'm drawing diagrams for them about how you set up a presidential office. And then it was snowing, and I don't know whether, I'm sure some of you have been to Prague, and I walked, I was staying in a hotel across town, and I walked down from the Castle Hill across Charles Bridge, and it was snowing, and I had a genuine out-of-body experience, which was, I never left here. I belong here. And then I thought, I wouldn't have known how to set up a presidential office if I'd been here. So I clearly have not been here. But what happened was then Václav Havel came to the United States for his first visit. And I did all the advance work for it. And he came, he was at the embassy, and I really was the perfect staffer. And I had developed the schedule, and I set up, you know, Q's and A's and all that, and he turns to the people he brought with him, and he said, now that is an advisor. And we became very, very good friends. I was there when he gave the speech to the joint session, and then he invited me to come back to, it was still called Czechoslovakia, and set me up. I stayed in the palace, and I thought, this is unreal. So, but we were very, very good friends, and he's somebody I miss, and he died last year, and I did some various things in life I thought I'd never do. But there were 3 speeches in the cathedral, in the eulogy, and the president, the foreign minister, and me, and I did the whole thing in Czech. So they are good, you know, because,
One of the pieces on exhibit upstairs in this fabulous new Read My Pins exhibit is the Order of the White Lion, which is the highest honor of the Czech government, and that was presented to Dr. Albright by Havel in 1997. So that must have been a pretty incredible experience.
It was an incredible experience, and partially it's very interesting because I thought a lot about what my life. I went back. Well, just one other fact. The first time I went back was in 1967 with my American name, an American passport, an American husband. And all of a sudden, somebody told me that my father had been tried in absentia and sentenced to death. It turns out the sentence to death part was not true, but I didn't know it at the time. And so I didn't feel exactly comfortable going back too many times. In the 80s, I went back several times under the auspices of the United States Information Agency. So I was protected and I stayed at the embassy. And whenever I went, I often wondered what I would have been like if we'd stayed, because it's I obviously speak Czech, I look Czech, and so I kind of blended in the woodwork. And so that's always been a part of my thought process, something that I actually look at in the third layer of the book. And so the fact that I was then honored by this president that I thought was so remarkable, and what had happened was I was an advisor, but I also did something the Clinton administration did something that I think was very important. And that is that immediately after World War II, I think the United States didn't quite understand what the Soviets were doing in putting together the satellites, their empire. And it wasn't until the Czechoslovak coup in 1948, that all of a sudden it became clear what was going on. And one of my predecessors, Dean Acheson, was very much behind setting up NATO. So NATO was really created in that way. So then, because life is full of fascinating coincidences, when I was secretary, we were able to expand NATO and to bring the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary into NATO. And so the combination of being able to do those things and then getting the Order of the White Lion was very nice in the castle by this president that I liked a lot.
What an incredible experience.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, as the first woman to crack the glass ceiling and join the so-called fraternity of Secretaries of State, I'd be curious to have you share whether some of your predecessors stepped forward to offer you words of wisdom when you were named Secretary of State.
Well, what was interesting was there's a wonderful phone call stuff that goes on. I just finished calling Secretary Kerry. So, it's a pretty small club. So they did call, but the best and funniest was Henry Kissinger. So he calls me up and he says, Madeleine, I'm delighted that this has happened, but you've taken away my one distinctive quality of being a foreign-born Secretary of State. And I said, no, Henry, I don't have an accent. And then he introduced me at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he said, welcome to the fraternity, Madeleine. And I said, it's not a fraternity anymore.
And what did he say?
No, he was fine, but I think that there is a very special kind of relationship. And the truth is that most of the people that were former Secretaries of State had been Republican Secretaries of State, and except for Warren Christopher, who had been my immediate predecessor, and I think we all spent quite a lot of time together, either in individual phone calls or the kind of thing that happened here at the Ford Library, where we in fact had panels and things together, and we still do spend a lot of time together, as a matter of fact, we're talking literally what just happened. One of the things that happened was when George Shultz, when Condi Rice was named, he said one of the customs that George Shultz had many jobs in the government, and one had been Secretary of the Treasury, and he said one of the things that we used to do in Treasury was that the former secretaries would give a dinner for the incumbent secretary. So why don't we do that for the Secretary of State? So we did that for Condi Rice, and then when Hillary was named, we did that for her, and I just got off the phone with Hillary saying, how are we going to do the one for John Kerry? So the bottom line is that it's a pretty tight group, and I think that people respect the difficulty of the job and try to be as helpful as possible.
That's really inspiring to hear, as a matter of fact. That's a question, believe me, I did not have the answer predetermined, and so that's actually very reassuring for all of us.
It's very important, I think, and I think the former presidents do this too, is that there are very few jobs that require this whole concept of taking care of the crown jewels of the United States. And so I think that it's a very important relationship. But one of the things now about John Kerry is that this little story doesn't work anymore, which is that my youngest granddaughter, when she turned 7 3 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. And in her lifetime, that would have been true.
That's great. That's wonderful. Speaking of that, and a Secretary of State from the other party, I understand that you have a rather unique relationship with Condi Rice.
Well, this is part of the really weird life that people have. My father was as I said, he came to the United States and defected, and one of the things that I now understand better is that the Rockefeller Foundation at that time found Central European intellectuals or something like that, and they found him a job at the University of Denver. We had no idea where Denver was. My parents bought a car. We started driving across America, and my mother said they called Denver the Mile High City, but we're not going up, so maybe we're going the wrong direction. Anyway, we get there. Ultimately, my father, he died in 1977, and he became a pretty big deal in Denver in terms of being kind of a local celebrity. And so there were a lot of flowers and tributes at his funeral, and among them was a ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with leaves and things in it. And I said to my mother, "So where did this come from?" And she said, "It's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice." She had gone to the University of Denver because her parents were associated with it. She was a music major, hence the piano, and she took an international relations course from my father, and he persuaded her to become an international relations major. She did her master's at Notre Dame, and she was working on her PhD with my father when he died. So this African-American woman from Alabama, music major, wrote her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. So in 1987, when I was working for my long string of losing Democratic presidential candidates, I was working for Michael Dukakis, and so my job was to get foreign policy advisors. So I thought, Soviet expert woman, teaches on the West Coast. So I called her up and I explained what I was doing and asked, Condi, would you like to join us? And she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We have the same father.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask just one more about your time as Secretary of State, and then we're going to go to the pins, because there's a lot of fun to be shared there. One of the most amazing things as I look at the position of Secretary of State is the travel. And the travel is incessant. And I understand that just within the last month or two, Secretary Clinton has actually surpassed your prior first place record in miles traveled and countries visited. The question is, how do you survive that?
Well, I have to say some of that is slightly disputable. If in fact, I talked to the people a lot of the people that I worked with then continue to work with me. I actually traveled 1,038,000 miles, but I also counted the travel that I did in the United States. So in foreign countries and foreign travel, Hillary has beaten me.
But you're still the overall.
Absolutely. Not that we're competitive or anything like that. But I think that what is interesting, first of all, you do have your own airplane. It does say United States of America. Now the plane I travel on says United Airlines. And you are very well taken care of in that regard. The job is so energizing, and I think that you work a lot all the time, and I loved it. The only problem is that sometimes you forget where you are. And so at a certain stage this was actually when I was still at the UN, traveled a lot, we were doing the Partnership for Peace, which was kind of the pre-NATO things. And I was going with General Shalikashvili, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we did like 4 or 5 countries a day. And so we finally decided that what we would do is get off the plane and say, we are so happy to be in your country to meet your leader. But I do think that ultimately it's when it's finished that you kind of think, how was I able to do this? The part that's hard is sleeping on command and then waking up and having to do meetings. And then the other part that I think is hard is that different countries operate on some totally different schedule. So the Saudis always like to talk at night, and by then you're just completely, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And But the part that I think is as the person that's the talker, you don't fall asleep. But I have brought with me Elaine Shokus, who is my chief of staff, so she can testify to this. Most of the unpleasant parts about traveling were the people on the staff who said, we have to be in this meeting. If I'm not in this meeting that you're having with the leader, then it shows you're not interested in my part of the world or my job or whatever. And so you'd go to the meeting, and invariably you'd be talking, and then I'd look over at my delegation, and they would all be asleep.
By the way, Dr. Albright's staff refused to be identified because they wanted us to use the time tonight for other things, but she is traveling with two wonderful people, Abby and Elaine, who have been terrific to work with on planning this exhibit.
Yeah.
So Dr. Albright has a tremendous support team, and we're delighted to have worked with them. Turning to the pins, we are the 12th venue for the exhibit of Read My Pins since it opened in New York City in 2009. It has received rave reviews everywhere. We are the third presidential museum coming after the Clinton and Carter libraries, and I would like to thank you for being bipartisan in allowing the Ford Presidential Library to have this exhibit. This is a marvelous exhibit, and I'd like to begin with asking you to share the story of how you got the idea of using the pins to send messages. I think it began with a serpent pin and a rock.
Well, I clearly love jewelry, but what happened was that none of it would have happened in the pin collection if it hadn't been for Saddam Hussein. So what happened was I went to the United Nations as ambassador in February '93, which was after the end of the Gulf War. And the ceasefire of the Gulf War had been translated into 6 Security Council resolutions that were very tight sanctions resolutions, and we wanted to make sure they would stay on. So I was an instructed ambassador, and my instructions were to say perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly, which he deserved. He'd invaded Kuwait. So after a while, there was a poem that appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them, an unparalleled serpent. So I happened to have a snake pin, so I decided to wear it when we were talking about Iraq. And so if you've ever seen, you know, how after Security Council meetings, the ambassadors go out and talk to the press, and all of a sudden the camera zeroes in and the reporter says, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" And I said, because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to reflect what I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, various kinds of insects and carnivorous animals. And the other ambassadors would say, "So what are we going to do today?" And then it was right after the first President Bush had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So I said, "Read my pins." And that's how it started. And it's gotten kind of bigger and better. And the whole purpose of the show, of the exhibit, is I obviously love to talk about foreign policy. And all the pins that are in it had some foreign policy story. So it makes foreign policy a little less foreign. And I've had a lot of fun with it.
That's terrific. In another situation as ambassador, there was the shooting down of 2 civilian aircraft in international waters by the Cubans. And you had some interesting things to say in that situation and got a real rave from President Clinton.
Yeah, well, what happened was that the planes had been shot down, and my instructions were to get condemnation of Cuba for what had happened. And in order to really get that, I needed to get the transcript of what the Cuban pilots were saying to each other as they were chasing these unarmed civilian planes over international waters. So I get the transcript. It was bloodthirsty, horrible. And all the words were translated except one. And they said, "We have cojones, they don't have cojones." And it went on like that. So I then went and had a press conference, and I decided that I would use the following line: "It's not cojones, it's cowardice." I had to call, Elaine was my person to make sure I wasn't tone deaf, and I said, "Do you think I can say this?" And she said, "Yes." So I then go out there, and I say that I thought the UN press corps would faint. And so what then happened was we did get condemnation of Cuba, and then President Clinton asked me, he said it's the best line of the administration, and then he asked me to go down and represent him at the funeral of the fallen pilots, and it was in the Orange Bowl. And so I went with some people that understood the Cuban-American community, and they said, this is a really serious, you can't smile, the whole thing is just very solemn. And we're driving towards the Orange Bowl on the freeway there, and all of a sudden pull kind of near a toll booth, and people come running out of their cars yelling, "Madam Cajones, Madam Cajones." Then I get to the Orange Bowl. We are coming in through the tunnel that the dolphins come out of, and 60,000 Cubans start screaming, "Cuba Libre, Madam Cajones." And so that was my most famous saying. There's a pin there that I wore during the press conference. This is one I had before too. It's a beautiful bluebird, and instead of wearing it with the head up, I wore it with the head down in solemn recognition.
There's more to that story than I knew was coming. The cover of your book features a contemporary pin in the shape of the head of the Statue of Liberty, and has two watch faces, one facing up and one facing down. So my question is, what is the meaning of the Statue of Liberty to you, and the message behind the pin?
Well, the pin, there was some of the exhibit stuff started much earlier. There was an exhibit that was commissioned of pins in my honor that were not my pins. The Statue of Liberty was one of them, and ultimately we got this one, but the others were not mine. But the clocks are the eyes, and one of them faces so that I could see whether it was time for a meeting to end, and the other one was for the person that was sitting across, although it created a lot of weird looks. But the Statue of Liberty means a great deal to me, and I'm wearing another one tonight, and that is that when we came to America, I came to America on November 11th, 1948. It was called Armistice Day at that point. And not, people always wonder, how did we escape? It wasn't so complicated. My father was a diplomat, and so we didn't come through Ellis Island. But I came to America on a ship called the SS America, and we sailed by the Statue of Liberty. And so I felt personally greeted by the Statue of Liberty, and it is the most amazing symbol of America. And as we are going through our immigration debate at this point, it is worth remembering what the Statue of Liberty stands for and what it says on its base.
That's wonderful. One of the most wonderful stories in your book pertains the gold peace dove that you received from Leah Rabin. You wore it for a speech about the Middle East situation in 1997. Could you tell us a little bit more about that pin and that relationship?
Well, Leah Rabin at that stage was already the widow of Yitzhak Rabin, and Yitzhak Rabin, I think, was one of the most remarkable Israeli prime ministers. And I have to say that every assassination is terrible, but if one thinks about all things that have happened since, I think it was one of the most tragic and historically devastating assassinations. And so Leah Rabin sent me this pin of the dove, and I wore it not only then, but whenever I gave a speech on the Middle East. But then one of the times when I arrived in Jerusalem, there was another package in my room, and it was a necklace of doves with a note that said something like, it takes more than one dove to make peace in the Middle East. But I try to wear the dove as much as I can.
And it's a beautiful necklace as well. Yeah. That's great. What pin in the collection got you into the most trouble, either with President Clinton or with other world leaders?
Well, there is no doubt about the following. Pins got me into trouble and out of trouble. So into trouble was there, you'll see the picture. During the 50th anniversary of the NATO alliance, we were in Washington. And by I don't know how we were sitting waiting to go on, and all of a sudden there's a picture of Secretary Cohen President Clinton and me on a sofa, and I don't know who started it, but we're, ones like this, we're the three monkeys. And it appeared in Time magazine. I mean, we really looked like crazy people. Anyway, I thought that the three monkeys, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil monkeys. So I was actually in Brussels, and I found these great three monkey pins. And so I had decided that President Putin's policy in Chechnya was evil. And so when we went for our summit in summer of 2000, I decided to wear the monkey. So we're going in, and President Putin turns to President Clinton and says, "We always notice what pin Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those monkeys?" And I said, "Because of your Chechnya policy." And he got furious. And President Clinton looked at me like, "Are you out of your mind? You are supposed to be the chief diplomat, and you have screwed this up." So so that's when they got me into trouble. But they did get me out of trouble once. And this is what happened. I invented the art of diplomatic kissing. You can't imagine Kissinger or whatever coming to a country, big embrace. But and so it was much more complicated than meets the eye, because the Latins, some kiss on the right cheek and some on the left, and a lot of bump noses, and then the French kiss twice and the Dutch 3 times. And then there was Yasser Arafat, just the thought, right? And he was kind of an indomitable kisser. It would be on the forehead, and it was, he and I were about the same height, but visualize it with President Clinton, So anyway, I arrive in South Korea. Big embrace, good conference, press conference, I leave, and all of a sudden I get a phone call. And I'm back in the United States, and it's a journalist saying, "So don't you think that the South Korean foreign minister should be fired about what he said about you?" And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Well, he just shouldn't have said that. We were all out at dinner." And I said, "Well, what did he say?" He said, "Well, I just love it when Secretary Albright comes. We're about the same age, and I'm this tired old man, and when I embrace her, she has very firm breasts. So what do you have to say about that?" And I said, "Well, I have to have something to put those pins on." So that's when they got me out of trouble.
And you thought presidential museums and libraries were boring places. Okay, Jim Kratzis has been gathering questions, and I'm going to invite Jim or Barb's going to do some reading of questions. Actually, yes, I'm Jim. Okay.
Yeah.
This is Barbara McGregor, our education specialist, who actually was the first on our staff to be aware of Dr. Albright's book and suggest it as an exhibit. So Barb deserves high marks for that. Okay. No.
Okay, there we go. No, I was really excited to see the exhibit, and I'm really pleased that we were able to bring it here to Grand Rapids. It's amazing. Anyways, I'm filling in for Jim here. We have a question. Do you think there was a president or administration that does not often get its just due in ending the Cold War?
Oh, I know what the answer is supposed to be, right? I tell you, I really do think that I've had a lot of thoughts about ending the Cold War, and I know that partially it has been said that we won the Cold War. The bottom line is they lost the Cold War. I think that, and it's not just a semantic difference. I think that the United States stood very firmly. I think various presidents worked very hard on it. I do think President Ford played a very big role in it in terms of understanding what the differences were and what the United States had to stand up for. But it wasn't just the ending of the war, but what happened afterwards. And I have to say this, that I think that President 41 Bush did an amazing job in terms of what happened as the Cold War wound down and how to deal with the reunification of Germany and a lot of the steps that they took.
Next question. Madam Secretary, what advice do you have for John Kerry in his new role? What are his major challenges?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I was listening to Senator Kerry during his testimony, and I think he has an amazing understanding of the issues. He, after all, has dealt with them for a very long time. I think that he is going to be faced with an incredible number of challenges. The world is a mess. There's no other way to describe it at the moment. And a lot of the kind of tools that we have don't exactly work. I teach a course. I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And we talk about bilateral diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy and the economic tools, the trade, which are the carrots and aid, and then the sanctions, then the threat of the use of force, law enforcement, intelligence. There's not a lot of tools, frankly. And the question is how you use them. And the tools are basically against nation states, of leaders who care about their territory and their people. And the biggest challenge is what we now call non-state actors, not just terrorist groups, but groups that operate outside of their governments. A lot of non-governmental organizations or multinational corporations that are stakeholders, and they are not part of a system. So the challenge is how to bring all those stakeholders in. And then I think in terms of the biggest challenge is, well, there's several of them. Obviously, what is going on with Iran and the nuclear issue, what is happening in the whole Middle East. And I have to, if I might say this, we've been calling it the Arab Spring, but what happened last winter, I was having a public dialogue with an Arab, and I said, well, it's winter, so we can't call it the Arab Spring, so let's call it the Arab Awakening. And he got really mad at me, and he said, the Arabs haven't been asleep all this time. And I said, well, what would you call it? And he said, Arab troubles. And I said, well, what about Arab opportunity? So if you just put those four thoughts together, you can see how complex it is. And so all of the Syria issue, then what has happened just now in North Africa, and then I do think that our most important strategic relationship is with China and how we deal with them. So there are many, many challenges, and I think that I'm very glad that he understands the issues as well as he does, and I hope he gets used to no sleep. Yeah.
How has the role of Secretary of State changed over the years?
Well, it's interesting because it has. I mean, you were saying that it was Thomas Jefferson's job, and it's much fun to think about that. I think that what has changed is that foreign policy, the Secretary of State is more and more part of a national security team. And the president is obviously the chief executive, and the question is how the team works together. What has changed, I think, the most is the number of countries to deal with, the 24/7 news cycle, which has changed a great deal, the development of social media, which makes it more complicated, WikiLeaks, because a lot of what diplomats do is gather they're the eyes and ears of the president in a foreign country, and they send back a lot of information about each other and the countries. I mean, just put yourself in the position of having whatever conversation you had about a third person in the public. So I think that it's the combination of new technology, the team aspect of it, the non-state actor part, and just the rapidity of the events that take place. But it's a great job. It is. I think it's the best job in the world. I really do. And even better than being president because you don't have to deal with health care.
Wonderful. Okay, a good follow-up question then. Of all of your experiences as Ambassador of the UN and Secretary of State, which was your most rewarding and why?
Well, this one, it's going to take me a minute to talk about, but you'll understand because I described my life to you a little bit before. as I said, life is passing strange. And the fact that when I was at the UN and Secretary of State, that one of the major things I had to do was deal with the Balkans. And here I knew Yugoslavia. I mean, I'd been there as a little girl, but also I was, my father's long dead. I'm still the perfect daughter, but I did anything that my father was interested in, and so I knew a lot about it. And so one of the major things I had to deal with, both at the UN and as secretary, was Bosnia and then Kosovo. I was very disturbed by how long it took us to get into Bosnia, and that a lot of people died by the time that we were able to make a change. And then Kosovo really happened on my watch. And so I was trying to figure out what we needed to do, and I felt that we could not stand around watching people being ethnically cleansed. And I think that if you all do read my Prague Winter, you can see that one could make the argument, I would not, but one could make the argument that we did not know what was happening during World War II. We did know everything that was happening in the Balkans. We now know everything that's happening everywhere. And what are our responsibilities? So I felt we needed to do something. And it was not simple. The State Department has no airplanes. And so first it was a matter of persuading our own government. As I said, the Secretary of State is part of a team, and so we had to persuade the Pentagon, and President Clinton wanted to do something about it. And so ultimately we decided that we needed to take some action. Then the issue was how to get the international community to support it. And I found out that the Russians were going to veto if we were going to do anything in the United Nations. And so then we had to go to NATO, and I invented something which sounds antediluvian at this point, but it was the international conference call. I talked to the major foreign ministers of Europe every single day about what we were doing. And finally, we decided to use air power to stop the ethnic cleansing. And the beginning was a disaster. The weather was bad. The Serbs put out decoys. And then I come into my office one day, and my exec says, "Sit down." I said, "What?" He said, "Just sit down." He said, "We've just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake." And one thing after another was going wrong. I did make the cover of Time magazine, and it was called Madeleine's War. And then when we won it, they called it something else. But when I went to Kosovo, to Pristina, and all those refugees that had been moved into Albania, they were back in a huge square in Pristina, and people were yelling, "Thank you, USA, thank you, USA." And I just went back to Kosovo this summer, and I was sitting there with two fathers that had brought their daughters with them, and one of them said, "Well, this is Madeleine, and this is Madeleine." And one Madeleine, they said, was they had not been able to have any children, and they promised themselves that if they ever had a child and it was a girl, they would call her Madeleine. And the other father had a similar story, and now there's a whole generation of little girls in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine. So I feel pretty good about that.
Other than yourself, of course, who has been the best Secretary of State post-World War II, and why?
That's tough. I think that there have been really remarkable Secretaries of State. I think that Dean Acheson really was a remarkable Secretary of State in terms of his creation. His book was called President at the Creation, in terms of the organizations that he set up. George Marshall was a remarkable Secretary of State. And I think that, I think knowing what the job is, I don't want to make any further judgments, but I do think that there have been Secretaries of State who have operated in very difficult circumstances and trying to figure out, and it's difficult for the following aspect, and maybe you all want to think about this more, is the question is, what is the role of the United States? What are our responsibilities? Do we believe that we need to be involved, but we're not the policemen of the world? And so I think that an awful lot obviously depends on who is president and how the president sees the role. I happen to really like Henry Kissinger, and I'm wading through the book that he wrote about China. And if you think about what he did with President Nixon in terms of opening China, is a remarkable job for a Secretary of State. By the way, Henry Kissinger, we just had this crazy dinner in Washington, which is the Alfalfa Club, which does nothing but just have this dinner. And they nominate somebody to be president of the nominee of the Alfalfa Party. And Henry Kissinger, they nominated. He's about to be 90, and he was really funny. And he said the following thing: there's always this issue about the relationship between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. And he actually said the only time they really got along was when he served in both posts at the same time.
All right, I'm going to go to actually two questions about the pins, and I'm going to read them both to you before you answer because they're, I think, very related. Which pin has the most sentimental value for you and why? And the second question is, there is a special pin that I believe was done by one of your daughters. Can you talk about that pin?
Yeah. Well, actually the questions go together, but the pin made by my daughter is the most sentimental one. It's a heart that I have worn, or I did wear, every Valentine's until it's been in the show. And so you'll see it. It's just a ceramic pin. And so my daughter is now 45 years old, and she said, "Mom, you have to tell people I made it when I was 5 years old." But I'm sure that many of you have a similar pin, and so it is the most sentimental. But another pin that is more recent, that is very important and sentimental, and it's the way the book ends, and that is that I went down to New Orleans a couple of years after Katrina, and I went to the D-Day Museum there, which is quite a remarkable museum in itself. And then there was a dinner afterwards, and I'm sitting at the table, and this young man comes over, and he says, "My father is sitting over there. He's a World War II vet, and he got 2 Purple Hearts, and he has this guy had this box, and he said, this is something that my father gave to my mother for their 60th wedding anniversary." So I opened the box, and it is this fabulous pin with 2 amethysts, which clearly must have related to the Purple Hearts, and said, "We want you to have this." And I said, "I can't." He said, "Our mother died as a result of Katrina." I said, "I can't possibly accept this from you." And he said, "No, you have to. It would mean a great deal to us if you took the pin." So I call it my Katrina pin, and it really is symbolic of the kinds of that even some inanimate object can have such meaning and value. And so it's a really beautiful pin, and I think it's very important to me.
One last part? One last? Okay. I saved this one. Who is the person you admire the most?
But that is practically impossible to answer because there are many people that I admire. I admire my parents incredibly. We all admire our parents, but I think that in writing this book of mine, of trying to figure out what they did and why they did it is something that makes me admire them even more than one normally admires parents, which is that, as I said, my parents were real patriots for this new country of Czechoslovakia, and then they are asked, they have to leave that country twice. They brought us to the United States, having left, when they went to England during World War II. As I said, they were very young. They left their parents there, never to see them again, and then they brought us to the United States to live a new life and to be able to be in this country. And my father used to say on a regular basis, people would always say, well, if you stayed in Czechoslovakia, you would have ended up as foreign minister. And he would never buy that. He wasn't into what ifs. And he said, there is nothing that is better than to be a professor in a free country. And people ask me if there was one word to describe myself, what it would be, and it would be grateful. Because I am so grateful to have been brought to America, to people ask me what the most important thing in my life is becoming an American citizen, hands down. There's no question about that. And then to have the opportunity to give back. So I admire my parents really for having been able to give us life twice, basically. And so there are many public figures I admire tremendously. I have worked for some of them. I admire President Clinton beyond measure. I think that he was an incredible president, and I was proud to work for him. And I admire people that are willing to lead this country, to understand the importance of democracy, understanding how the system works. And so I would like to admire everybody in Washington because we need to figure out how to understand how grateful we need to be to live in America and have the opportunity to play a role internationally.